So what exactly happens when we die? The answer to that question is different depending on whom you ask. In fact, many people have many different views. Two of the most interesting responses to that would be in our secular materialist culture that's been around for maybe 300 years or so, believing there is nothing that you can't see, touch, or feel. And so there's no life after death. If you can't feel or touch it, it can't exist. So when you die, that's it. And that's, I would say, a fairly common view in a lot of our culture today in the United States. But it's new. It's only been around, that way of looking has only been around for, a couple, 300 years or so. A more traditional view is one held by more traditional Christians who believe that there is life after death, and that when you die and then when you're finally admitted to heaven, you're only admitted if you accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior on earth. Everyone else would go to hell, so only Christians would go to heaven. That Christian tradition has believed that your body, when you die, goes into the ground, and the soul remains asleep until Judgment Day. And that's often why people are against, traditional churches are against cremation. In this view, no one is in heaven yet. Here's a quote from a theologian, evangelical author, William Lane Craig. He sums it up, this viewpoint, by saying, "For the believer, what awaits us when we die is an intermediate state of disembodied existence, which will bring us closer in a more intimate fellowship with Christ. And we await that our state will have an eventual resurrection, which occurs only when Christ returns." So under this worldview, when Jesus comes again, there will be a great judgment day, and people will rise from their graves and they'll be judged. If they accepted Christ, they'll go to heaven. And if they didn't, they'll go into the fiery pits of hell. This was a challenging view for many centuries within churches that had these views because what about babies? Babies can't accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. So the Catholic Church actually created something called limbo, a state for babies who were not baptized to go into. But in 2007, the Pope reversed course on that and ended the teaching of limbo. So these viewpoints on life after death are in flux. Where the secularist and the fundamentalist might agree is they would say, one, no one knows exactly for sure what happens. And they might also agree that no one is in heaven right now, but they'd be saying it for very different reasons. So this is what makes the tradition that we're part of very unique, and I have found it to be very helpful. And that's what I'm going to share today, is our viewpoint based on the insights of Swedenborg, who claimed to have seen and experienced this and wrote about it, and describes it in great detail. We believe that when you, first off, that when you die, there's within that moment, you transfer to a new dimension, a spiritual world, and to heaven right away. It's not something that happens on a day of judgment in the future. And you can see that from Jesus' teaching. When he is on the cross, he turns to the thief next to him, and the thief sort of says, "I believe in you. I believe in you, Jesus," in so many words. And Jesus says, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." So Jesus is teaching us there, even in that comment, that the connection to heaven happens immediately. And Jesus also told a parable about a beggar named Lazarus and a rich man. And the rich man is suffering in what looks like hell and says, "Please go back. And Lazarus, can we go back and tell my brothers to be better people?" So the implication from the story that Jesus tells is that heaven and the experience of leaving this earth happen right away. And that's what Swedenborg's description is of what happens when we die. And so it aligns with those teachings from Jesus. Now, in recent years, cutting edge science has supported many of Swedenborg's insights that he gained through his mystical experiences. In 1976, Dr. Raymond Moody wrote a best-selling, sort of game-changing book on the topic called Life After Life. And it really popularized the whole study of what is now called near-death experiences. And in that 1976 book, he actually cites Swedenborg as having the closest insights to what he has observed as a scientist in modern times. And now there's been a whole slew of books on the topic. And what's interesting is they're all coming from doctors. They're coming from people with medical expertise. One is called Heaven and Back, a doctor's extraordinary account of her death. Heaven, Angels, and Life Again, a true story by Dr. Mary Neal. It's actually a very fun book. It's a great narrative of her getting trapped in her kayak or canoe under the water, and describes in great detail what she experienced. And there's another book called Touching Heaven, a cardiologist encounters with death and life and proof of the afterlife. And another famous one is that's been out lately is Proof of Heaven, a neurosurgeon's journey into the afterlife by Eben Alexander. And it's interesting that each of these are people with medical backgrounds, and they're sharing these near-death experiences in a scientific way, which is kind of interesting because Swedenborg himself was a leading scientist of his day. The other phenomena that seems to me relatively new, I'm sure it always took place, but it's quite dramatic, is this whole field of near-death experiences. In 2011, 9 million people reported having them. And there's a website called the International Association of Near-Death Experiences. And if you go on that, it's a fun site. It's IANDS.org. You'll see hundreds of stories of people who share their near death, meaning they had an experience of life after death and they came back. And what's pretty amazing is how many commonalities there are. And they're very common to what Swedenborg wrote about. So I think we're getting insights through these scientists into a spiritual realm that can be extremely helpful. I find this knowledge very helpful to people who have lost someone, and I think it's very helpful to people who talk to me when they face death. The best summary for what happens when we die is something that I read in the funerals that I do, and I'm going to just read what I say. I say. I think it's a good summary. And this is taken from the Swedenborg's insights. When the body can no longer perform its function in the natural world, it is separated from our spirit. This is called dying. But we continue to be ourselves and live. We live because life comes not from the body, but from the heart, from the soul. After all, it's the spirit that thinks and loves in us. We only pass from the consciousness of one world to another. We take everything that makes us a person except our earthly body, which is laid aside because it is of no further use. The Apostle Paul talked about it when he said there's a natural body and there's a spiritual one. One is put off, the other is put on. And also the Apostle Paul said, we know that if the earthly frame that houses us today should be demolished, we possess a building which God has provided, a house not built by earthly hands, but is eternal and in heaven. So after death, because we remain essentially the same person, we're immediately recognized and welcomed by those who go before us, and we rejoice in their company. So I love that quick summary of what the death experience is like. But let's go a little further. What happens next? Well, what happens next is that we're given two angels, and that was what one of the readings was today, describing that we get two angels who protect us in what is a complex transition. They sit with us, they share their thoughts with us, they guide us. And many of the near-death experiences confirm that people describe an incredible calm, an incredible peace. There's no pain, there's no distress. Even people who have suffered horrible situations like bad accidents or tortures describe feeling peace and no pain in this experience, which I find is quite lovely, particularly because many of us, when we transition out, are in a state of pain. So to know that people are out of that is a really wonderful thing. Then the people who die are lifted or almost peeled out of their physical bodies at death with these guides coming to them. And very often they look at themselves. They can see themselves in a bed, they can see the room. In many of the near-death experiences now, we're getting something close to science in that people are telling of conversations that took place with the family, but down the hall. outside of where the person is being hospitalized. So that's a very common experience too. People actually looking at their own physical body below them and experiencing what's going on. So be careful what you say when people are dying, because they can hear you. Not that you wouldn't say nice things. There's even stories of people who, to help in their transition, attend their own funerals or memorial services as spirits to help them in the come to terms with the transition. So then leaving the physical body happens, it happens right away. And people describe being pulled, some describe it like a gravity. Others, a very common thing is saying that I was pulled into a tunnel or a light. And that's what Swedenborg describes as well. Many people think of the passage from Psalm 23, yea, though I go through the valley of death. They feel like that's what they're experiencing. That's the valley of death that they're going through. So it's again, it's never described, I shouldn't say never. In the vast majority of experiences that I've read, it's been always a positive experience. And that people are calm and that concerns are addressed. It's very often that people, when they're transitioning, are very worried about the people they're leaving behind, and those concerns are spoken to. So then what happens next? Okay, after death, then the guides usually bring people into a spiritual plane. It's not yet heaven. It's almost like, I like to think of it like an Ellis Island. It's a transport point, often called the spiritual world. And there, the world that they come into is very much like the world they left. And continuity seems to be a very important factor. So you'll see the same clothes or houses or trees that you're familiar with. So it creates a familiar setting. And then by all accounts, everybody who reaches this point describes what they describe as a beautiful homecoming. And the phrase they use repeatedly is, you cannot express the joy that I experienced. When I start meeting people I knew, I feel like I've come home. I never imagined it could be so great. And so it's beyond our ability to describe, a joy beyond our ability to describe when we have this reunion and this homecoming. This is one reason that many people who have these near-death experiences, if they had them, that means they came back, right? They're unhappy to come back. It's a very strange thing. They say, I really did not want to come back to Earth. I really wanted to stay in that joy. So, well, there are many different people, so they're going to have many different reactions. Some people have no belief, right? Some people are more of a completely materialistic. You know, there's all different types of human beings crossing over, and they each have a different experience. These are just some of the common themes. But one of the, for people who are observed that are very materialistic, and by that I mean greedy, not just, you know, but really greedy, and they have a complete disbelief that they've died, they actually go for a period of time where they are convinced they have not died. I thought that was fascinating. In other words, they ease into it, but they cannot admit that what they thought was wrong, so they have a time of adjusting. Others, it's described, who didn't believe in life after death, but they were, you know, good people, led a good life, lived others. They just are described as feeling a bit embarrassed for not understanding it, but they quickly adapt. And then the angels engage with people in almost, I don't know, a coaching or a therapeutic way. They ask them questions. So what did you expect? What did you think was going to happen? And people explain, and there's examples where people talk about, I expect there's ghosts, and I'm still in denial, or I believe angels look like this. And so they work with them as they arrive in this new space. But eventually people are pretty thrilled to know that death did not kill them. And they also realize that they are still themselves. They have the same understanding, the same thoughts, same desires. It's just not in a physical body. And then they're eased into it by common backgrounds and spaces and clothes that are familiar. Okay, so then what? What happens next? Okay, well, the next thing that happens is recorded in Swedenborg's writings, but it's also in Dr. Moody's writings and many of the NDEs. It's such a common experience that you've heard of it, and that's the life review. The purpose of heaven and the purpose of our life on earth is spiritual growth. To continue that spiritual growth, you have to become aware of yourself. And there's this review process is an awareness process, like putting a mirror on your soul. I thought it was interesting in Swedenborg's time that people would read a book about their life and every detail. And he describes an inner spiritual memory that we all have that records everything in our life. And the modern near-death experience reports that I've read more often describe watching a movie review of your life. And that's as reported by Dr. Moody. And in this review, people see, whether it was a book or a movie, people see essentially their entire life, and they see all the impact they had, good and bad. That means they can see that they did things they weren't even aware that hurt people's feelings. They did things that for people that made people's lives and trajectory of their life changed. So we see all of that. And it sounds a little scary if you think about it, particularly seeing the negative reaction that some of your comments might have had to people or your actions. Sometimes you didn't know, but sometimes you knew what you were doing. And it's not a shame factor. It's not a judgment factor. It's an awareness factor. And according to the reports, the angels that guide us are forgiving, loving, and compassionate. But many of us who go through this, we have our own forgiveness to have for witnessing what we've done. But this process creates an awareness that's extremely important. And then it increases our chance for heavenly joy to see it through it. From the NDE stories that I've read, people coming back, they often come back around this point to our existence, and they have no fear of death, and they have a sadness returning. Some of them still don't believe in God or anything like that. It's kind of interesting. They say, I don't know exactly what it was. I don't believe in religion, but this is what happened. Okay, well then after this review, what happens next in this period? And again, it's different for everybody, but a very common thing is that homecoming sort of continues, and very often there are family reunions, and that in families where there are divisions, they don't pop back up. So you might think, oh, I don't want to see certain people. I'm sure you don't have to, but it seems like that's smoothed over. And one of the reunions that I read about was going back a couple centuries, which I thought sounded very cool. So this is a very positive. We start off with calm, we start off with love, we experience joy, we experience forgiveness, we experience compassion. So, okay, what happens to the evil people? I mean, people who really lived an evil life. First, I should say that unlike a lot of Christian traditions, what's described is very much what we read in the book of James today, that it's really, you can't have faith without works. In other words, you can say you believe in Jesus, and if you didn't live a life of love, that doesn't cut it. On the flip side, if you live a life of love and compassion for others, but you don't have the right theology, that actually can be worked out. But there are people who, when they transition over, their greatest love is themselves, selfishness, greed, dominion. They love evil. And for those people, as a product of God's love, they're given their free will to be with others like them for eternity. And this is what we would call hell. So no one's condemned to hell, but people choose it, and it's where they're most comfortable. So that's what happens with people who have those kind of things going on in their life. It's they would be in a hell. And it's an odd statement that says that people in hell are not unhappy because they're doing what they enjoy the most, although it looks repulsive to watch. So eventually, on the heavenly side, we kind of sort out into our angelic community. We meet people very often that we've never met on earth, and we feel that there are kindred spirits. There is a community that exists that they are, I guess the best way to say it is they resonate with us, they have our vibe, and this brings incredible joy, and it's a wonderful community to live in. Well, what about marriages? It's a question I often get asked, particularly when someone's a widow or a widower, right? What happens with marriages? And it seems to me there is, for many people who have a deep, soulful marriage, that continues. But I was surprised in some of the readings how kind of practical it was. Some people on the other side, they find that they weren't really soulmates. They were together for a variety of purposes, but it didn't really operate at the soul level. And so they actually find someone else. But it seemed like there's no pressure either way, which I thought was neat. In heaven, there's continual growth after that. So that's really what happens. You grow spiritually in this new world. And there's a cute little line that says, as you grow older in heaven, you grow younger. So those are some rapid fire, quick summary of many books, of many near-death experiences that I wanted to share with you to give you some sense of this process of, being taken out of the body, being guided, being reunited, and just the whole process is calming, caring, compassion, and love. And it's a very positive experience. I think that's maybe the most important reason for preaching on this today and studying this topic, because for so many people, death is the thing they fear the most. Our culture, our secular culture, basically doesn't talk about death at all, as if by talking about it, you invoke it. And we pretend in this culture that we're going to sort of live forever, and someone dies and we're kind of shocked. But there's a great deal of denial going on. We all will die physically on this earth, and we should be thinking about it. We should have thoughts and, study it and be aware of it. But we've kind of put it off, and we've medicalized death in a very unhealthy way, in my opinion, where physicians now look at death very often as a failure when it's a very natural process. It's something that is out of their control. It will happen. Another reason I think it's important to look at death through this beautiful lens is that many people that I've talked to over the years who are dying have that faith of a very judgmental God, and they're very afraid they're going to go to hell. You may have heard me preach on this, but I've had numerous examples where people have said, I'm staying alive. Or maybe the most graphic one was my friend Eduardo, dying of AIDS. I have shared before, but I am going to go to hell. I'm Catholic, and that's what they said. He just fought death, and it's just unhealthy. So you can actually give people peace of mind by offering a different vista into what's next. And it's not, for people who live a life of love, it is not, damnation and eternally pits of fire. I think that's another reason we could know about it. And finally, I think understanding death actually makes this life make more sense. There's a lot of chaos, there's a lot of evil, there's a lot of trouble, there's a lot of struggle. And when we look at the long arch of our life story eternally, it puts things in perspective on this planet, which I think is very, very important. So in summary, I would just say death is not the end, but it's a wonderful new beginning that we should all embrace. Amen.